Thank you for tuning in to Sundays at the Square. I'm your host, Toni Ringgold, and I hope everyone is having a wonderful weekend thus far. I have a very special guest with me today. We are continuing our talk about domestic violence. We're also going to be touching on sexual assault, being that it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. This conversation was so important, and I received a lot of good feedback from it, and so I wanted to keep it going, and I have a very special guest, like I said, with me. I'm going to allow her to introduce herself and tell you a little bit about who she is.
Well, all right then. Well, thank you, ma'am. My name is Lolita Gilmore. I am a victim advocate, amongst all things, minister, wife, mother of 3 beautiful children, and I'm just glad to be here with you. This is exciting. And my joy of all is serving the community as an activist, as an advocate, amongst many other things. And one of the areas that I do love most is helping the underserved populations that's dealing with domestic violence, and those and I say underserved populations because we don't have a lot of resources out there,
Right.
and disenfranchised, because you look around and there's a lot of things that we do need to do to make things a little bit better.
Yes.
And so with that, also we have a outreach program. That outreach program, what we do is we take care of, counsel, and minister victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and those dealing with sex trafficking. And we do that from a standpoint, it's from a Christian worldview, but we also use evidence-based practices. So we do have counseling services. So in doing that, individuals that may come in for help, as we open up our residential part of it, they will come in for help, but they will also, instead of getting a bed, they get a complete program. Okay.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So when you say a complete program, what does that mean exactly?
Well, what I mean by a complete program is what I'm saying is that you have to have a system in place.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at domestic violence, when we look at dynamics, family dynamics, period, we're talking about systems.
Yes.
And so when we start talking about systems, we have to look and understand, what can I do to better assist this family? What needs, need to be met? How can I assess, and how can I look at the family background? We understand that we look at things from a biological, psychological, social and spiritual perspective. So when we look at all those components, we have to have an understanding is, how can I put this together to make a sound program?
Okay.
So that's what I mean about having those programs in place. So in doing that, once the individual comes in, if I'm angry about the situation, let me get the anger management. In order for prevention, let me learn about domestic violence and get the prevention program. If I have a problem with forgiveness and I just can't get past it, let us do the spiritual, the Christian counseling, with that. If I have some areas in the problems with parenting, let me get my parenting skills more up to par.
Wow, so you give a full
So it's a full
gamut.
program. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
That's amazing. Let me ask you a question, because, especially and I don't want to make this a black thing, but especially in the black community, when you talk about things like domestic violence and sexual assault, it's always oftentimes overlooked, or it's like, everybody went through it, so get over it. What are some of the effects that domestic violence and sexual assault can have on a person?
Well, some of the primary effects that we have is trauma. When you start dealing with trauma, unresolved trauma, it shows up in other places. It shows up in how we take care of our kids, or lack of taking care of our kids. It shows up in how our self-esteem, or lack thereof. So it goes into the whole person. It shows up in mental illness, and we see that. And like you said, from a cultural perspective, we normalize a lot of things.
Right.
And so in looking at that, you said, well, is it a social problem? Not only is it a social problem, it's a cultural problem, because, a lot of times, most behaviors are learned. So we learn how to treat each other. We learn how to allow people to treat us.
Right. Absolutely. So when a person is in a situation and they are trying to get out of it, what are the steps? What do they go through mentally to start getting them prepared to leave a bad situation? What are the questions that they should start asking or things that they should do?
Well, one of the things they need to define what is a healthy relationship.
Okay.
And in looking at that, and if that relationship is causing harm, if it gets to a point where you can't be yourself, if it gets to the point where you've been isolated from all your friends, all your family, we begin to look at a progression. It progresses. And so it may start off something as simple as, well, I don't like the way you do your hair. I don't like the clothes that you wear. And you see what people begin to, and I hear young ladies, when he was picking out my clothes or, telling me what to wear, what friends I could have, controlling money, because it's about power and control. That's the bottom line up front. It's about power and control. And so even when it comes to finances, I have to ask for money to get diapers, ask for money to put food in the house. There's no collaboration there. No collaboration, no choice, no trust, no safety in the relationship. And so when we get to that place, we have to examine that and say, wait a minute, is this, because I'm a faith-based component with our outreach program, minister, so I will make reference to, my faith. You have to ask God, is this where I'm supposed to be?
Is this how I'm supposed to live?
Yeah, am I supposed to live this way? And if you find yourself having questions to that degree, because love doesn't hurt. Well, it shouldn't hurt in that, not physically, it shouldn't hurt. And so when we look at child abuse, children should be able to express themselves and without being fearful, of the parent. The same thing in a healthy relationship. I should be able to be with my spouse or significant other or my intimate partner without being fearful, of that individual. So when you ask, what are the steps? Acknowledgement, understanding what domestic violence is, understanding, sexual assault, understanding these different dynamics. So when you understand that, how do we move forward in that? So now we want to start seeking assistance. Have a plan in place. What is your safety plan? Look at a safety plan. Identify some areas.
And a lot of people talk about, I want to stop you right there, because a lot of people, for our listeners who are just tuning in, you are tuned in to Sundays at the Square. I'm your host, Toni Ringgold. I'm sitting here with Mrs. Lolita Gilmore. She is the author of A Simple Leaf, and also she is the founder of Teach Them to Love Outreach. We're sitting here right now. We're talking a little bit about domestic violence and sexual assault and how to get out of a situation if you are in one. And one of the things that Mrs. Gilmore just touched on was having a safety plan, having a safety plan in place. For some of our listeners, they may not even know what a safety plan is. So I want to talk about that for a second. What is a safety plan?
A safety plan is where you identify some resources. And what I mean by those resources, the first thing I want to do is I want to have me a group and my safety, my support system, establish that I need to let my friend or a close family member know what's going on with me. I need to let them know that these are the challenges that I'm facing. And so with that, then I begin to make a plan. How do I look to move forward? Well, the first thing I want to start doing, I want to start gathering, especially if we have children, we want to start gathering all of our necessary documents that we have, birth certificates, social security cards, things of that nature. You want to start gathering those. You want to put them in a safe place. You may need to take them to mom's house. You may, someone that you can trust, get your P.O. box, what have you. But you want to begin to build up that path to say, I'm getting ready to make my move out of this door. Because when victims leave, that is the worst, the most dangerous time is when a victim decides to leave a relationship.
Absolutely.
Because when we talk about, if it's about power and control, and now you're leaving the person, what are they losing? They're losing the control. They're losing their power. And to some, that's why we say with abuse, it progresses. And sometimes it becomes very lethal. And we see that today. We hear about the shootings. We hear about, a husband shooting down his wife or what have you. We hear this. It's too common.
And this is the thing that I think that people need to understand, because they look at that person that they love and they lay next to, and they don't honestly think that that person can do that. But they absolutely can. Sometimes
they can and they will. And they do.
And they are. And it happens a lot. It happens all the time. And, you have to ask yourself, if a person is able to slap you, if a person is able to choke you, if a person is able to threaten to kill you, what makes you think that he won't or she won't actually go through it. And I think that that's something that people really need to take heed to and really listen to. Um,
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I will say is that sometimes I don't think people understand that they're even in a domestic situation, because they may come from abuse. They may
Mm-hmm.
have seen that or felt that. But I believe that deep down inside, there's a little voice inside of you that's telling you that this is not right. And even if that voice is small and you're not sure of that voice, you need to listen to it.
You do need to listen to it. You do need to listen to it. Anything that's threatening, anything that's hurtful, anything that's unwanted, and in the form of physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial, sexual abuse, and it comes in those. I mean, because we're identifying with, there are different areas, of abuse, and so in looking at all of that, you have to ask yourself, this is not normal.
Right.
This is not the norm, and so that's the first thing we have to identify, that that's not normal, and we have to identify that because oftentimes, depending on our cultural background and where we're from, our demographics, how we were raised, our social environment, we'll see that practices that we've learned along the way, we implement them. So what we call them learned behaviors.
Right.
So with these learned behaviors, we see it, the children do it, and that's why child abuse is such a critical component. We have to get a handle on that because learned behaviors.
Learn behaviors. Absolutely. Man, this is a really really good conversation that we're having here. Some people may ask why 2 weeks in a row, Tony? Well, because like I said, this is a conversation that you can't just sum up in 1 week. You just can't. And there are quite a few people that have come to me after this and wanted to get more information and more in-depth teaching. And Miss Lolita, she has some real knowledge here. She actually has some statistics that I think that you should probably listen to. So if you're just tuning in to Sundays at the Square, I'm your host, Toni Ringgold. We're going to get some statistics about domestic violence and sexual assault.
And this is one of the things I wanted to tell you. When it comes to domestic violence, and why is it so prevalent? Because when we look at the reporting procedures and what people do, a lot of people don't come forward. They don't come forward for various reasons. Embarrassed, the shameful, not wanting anybody to know about it. And then a lot of times, like you said, not knowing really what to do. So when we look at that, 1 out of 7 men will report. So that means you got 6 out there is not reporting and it's going on.
And men do.
Men do, and that's why I highlighted that first. Yes.
And they get abused
they
as
get
well.
abused as well.
And a lot of times, it has to be embarrassing for a man
to
say, I'm in a situation I have to get out of because I'm being abused.
Yes.
Yeah.
And oftentimes you will hear a lot of men say that, well, they don't leave because now if I leave, what about the children? And so they believe the same thing that the female believes. I stay in this because of the children, for the sake of the children. And so with that, then we look at the women, 1 out of every 4 women. So when we look at that, so there's 3 others not being reported and not receiving the help.
So how do they get that data? How do they know that there are 3 other women? I've always wondered about that. Like, they say 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 7. Like, how do they know that there are other people that are dealing with it?
They base that those are national statistics. And so when you see the National Organization of Domestic Violence, when you look at that, this is going across, they're looking at the hospital, the emergency room visits, and you see it. The people
you
come
know
in,
what it
know
is.
what it is. Now whether she decides or he decides to say what it is evident to the onlooker and to the medical provider. So we look at those numbers.
And so medical providers, they have a responsibility to report it, what they see, whether the person wants to seek legal action or not.
They report it. You're right. Everything is reported. Even looking at CDC, all these things are reported. Now, will legal action or anything, a legal recourse take place only if the victim is willing to move forward? So when you look at that, and I'm going back to that because you were asking how do we come up with these statistics. And so with that, so now we look at all the emergency rooms visits, we look at the police calls and all this stuff and say, now, how many people out of all of this, who's reporting what? And so you start to see that not very many reports. In the state of Texas, we have what we call the the Crime Victims Compensation Program.
Yes.
So when you look at how many applications actually go through that program, as opposed to the number of incidents that have occurred, you know, in the Central Texas area, that's how you begin to look like, wait a minute, something's wrong. The numbers are wrong here. Well, the numbers aren't wrong. It's just that
people aren't reporting.
People aren't reporting.
Now, I do know that in Texas, by law, there's a call that comes out with some type of family violence. Somebody's going to jail. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. And this is what we're finding. If the police report to that house, and this is how you will often hear, it was a physical altercation. I'm sorry. It was a verbal altercation that became physical. So when they get to the household, if someone has sit there and there's no markings, if you and I, we have a dispute, and they get there, there's no markings on you, there's no markings on the other individual, there's no cause, because no harm has been done to take anyone in. And so with that, she can say, well, and what they will do is say, well, someone needs to leave. Let's have a cool down period. In some cases, it's like a 72-hour cool down period or 24-hour cool down period. But either way, when they leave that house, they're going to ask somebody to leave. But because now, then we get with Texas, a community state. And when we're talking about that, everything belongs to each other. So can I literally make you leave if no crime from where I can see has been committed?
Not really.
Not really.
Okay. If you're just tuning in to Sundays at the Square, I'm your host, Toni Ringgold. We're going to take a quick break. I'm having a wonderful conversation with Mrs. Lolita Gilmore. She is the author of A Simple Leaf. We're going to talk about that in a second when we come back, and we have some announcements. Stay tuned.